And I think that reclaiming of what I like to call traditional wisdom,
Yes.
eternal principles, I think the time has come because economic theorists are beginning to challenge this idea of unbridled capitalism, which is simply utility maximizing.
You say that you need faith to recognise that we're all connected. You don't really. If you look at the global warming crisis, it's obvious. Climate change is a reality. The scientists prove it. And we are actually bringing about floods, which is the Noah story. We actually are bringing about floods because of the way we're behaving, because we're not caring for each other, and we have no care for the planet.
I can't work this out. How do we end up in a situation where we worship money? Because, you've talked about fiat currency and all this. So literally, we're talking about quantitative easing, fiat currency. It's just money made up by the press of a button.
The Manna Journey is the catalyst for change in our world. It's a consistent source of truth for the next generation and current leaders. Our mission is to change the world by reframing our current governance, by using ancient wisdom to solve modern problems, and by shaping innovative new businesses to have a culture of pursuit of purpose.
This is an episode of the Manna Journey created by Phillip Ullmann. The Manna Journey is a whole new concept in economics, in business and in governance, where we take the wisdom of the Bible to create innovation in business and indeed then push that through to a change in our society through good governance. Today, I'm going to be talking to Phillip himself and, of course, a great businessman and a friend of ours, I think, Suhail Mirza. So take it away.
So can you explain to me is Joseph a key player as far as the Islamic faith is concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the holy book of Islam is the Quran, and there is a chapter, one of the 114, a chapter dedicated solely to this story. It has a slight variations to the story in Genesis or the Christian version, but he's a prophet of the Almighty and hugely revered as is Jacob and Isaac and Abraham all the way back to the covenant. So he's a fundamentally important. This story is celebrated theologically and in literature. So it's a very beautiful story. Has a huge impact and relevance today.
Just a matter of interest. You say Joseph's really significant in the Quran. Is that unusual? I mean, how many of the people we read about in the Old Testament, as I would call it, feature in the Quran?
There's a number of them, of the prophets I've just mentioned, all the Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, and Joseph we've just talked about here just in the Genesis. But yeah, you can go back into Daniel, many other. Noah is featured in the Quran. And it's not just the Old Testament. Jesus himself is featured very, very highly in the Quran. So Islam sees itself as very much a part of that process of a perennial message that has come to all people around the world. So it says that every nation on earth has received a prophetic message, which has been the same. And that message, in essence, has been called oneness. In Arabic, it's called Tawheed. It means that everything's connected. So we can't see everything alone. The point that you've made earlier, the idea of externalities and environmentalism, we have to make sure that we look at everything and the impact on all stakeholders, which is effectively, I think, what Phillip was talking about in the story.
Do you know something? We forget this, and really it's a bit stupid of us to forget. But of course, the common principles in Christianity, Islam and Judaism exist because, fundamentally they're branches of the same religion. Let's be entirely honest.
Yeah, well, you can't understand Islam without the Jewish and Christian background. And Jews and Christians are regarded as people of the book. That's the actual phrase that's used in the Quran. So I think there's a hell of a lot more that unites us than divides us.
The key is to work together. I mean, the numbers of Muslims, the numbers of Christians, massively outnumbers the numbers of Jews. The only way we can actually start to address the problems in the world we live in is by working together and starting to set examples of how we can become role models of how to behave in a different way.
And I think that reclaiming of what I like to call traditional wisdom, eternal principles, I think the time has come because taking a secular view, for example, just stepping out of that, I alluded to some of the work that's going on. So economic theorists are beginning to challenge this idea of unbridled capitalism, which is simply utility maximizing. Yanis Varoufakis is a professor of economics, recently published a book about the power of techno-feudalism, Jeremy Rifkin is a very well-known philosopher talking about the idea of a collaborative age. So I think so there's a secular trend there already.
So I suppose you could say these are human principles. I mean, we would argue they're human principles because they're laid down by God, but it wouldn't matter. They're human principles either way.
We have to talk to, and that's why stories are so beautiful, because they talk to people no matter whether they have faith or not. The message of looking after each other and looking after the planet doesn't depend on being faithful. It's humanitarian. We have to look after each other, and therefore we have to be role models. We have to address those without faith as well.
But I think also the opposition to overconsumption, which is something that you talk about, is something that's a principle in Islam, without a doubt.
Yes, one of the main principles of Islamic economic systems is contained in the word adl, which means balance. So a balance between extremes. So the idea that you can labour productively and earn wealth absolutely is lauded, and it's actually an obligation. It's an act of worship to actually work productively, but you don't do it at the expense of other people. There's an element of equitable justice that's part of that whole process.
But it's got to be difficult to practice that in real life. I mean, because it's a question every single day, isn't it? What am I doing for myself? What am I doing for my family? What am I doing for my shareholders? But what am I doing for the wider society?
That is going to be difficult depending on your worldview. So in the Abrahamic faiths, the worldview is that we are made in the image of the Almighty. We have an obligation. We are made accountable to the Almighty beyond our finite existence on this earth. So if we have that frame, then becoming a lot more connected in your view is slightly easier. Those who don't have that faith, you're right that we have to appeal to everybody because this applies, but I'm already beginning to see that. I work a lot as a speaker in wellness and well-being globally, and particularly within the health service. And one example there, the World Health Organization 75 years ago defined health as mental, physical and social well-being. But now there's a big trend to include what they call spiritual well-being. And how they define that is a sense of meaning, purpose and connection, which is exactly what the Abrahamic faiths are talking about, and exactly the story in Joseph.
But you say that you need faith to recognize that we're all connected. You don't really. If you look at the global warming crisis, it's obvious to people that are looking for the truth that climate change is a reality. The scientists prove it. And we are actually bringing about floods, which is the Noah story. We actually are bringing about floods because of the way we're behaving, because we're not caring for each other and we have no care for the planet. Floods are happening and the temperature is changing. And therefore you can see this oneness that you describe. It's obvious from the world that we live in that if we don't work together as one, we are destroying the planet and we're destroying each other.
One of the things you talk about a lot is on the issue of finance and the way that things have run out of control. And one of your pet hates is derivatives, because there's no point to them. You know, there was a time when the Christian faith was very against the idea of usury or interest and loans and that sort of thing. But we've moved away from that. But I get the impression that in the Islamic world, the idea of attempting to have real economics rather than banking dominating everything still does exist as a principle.
Yeah, I think banking dominates everything. You're right. It depends how we define banking. So banking is a system that provides and fuel for capitalism. Nobody's going to disagree with. But if we move, it has to be linked to a real economy.
Right.
So that's the most important thing. Was if you take a straw poll of the value from GDP value of the world economy, whatever that is. If you look at the derivatives value, it's multiples. Well, it's unrealistic. And I think when we divorce ourselves from financial instruments tied to actual reality, I think we have a problem. I think the classic example being the dollar coming off not connected to gold standard. So now we have fiat money. That's fine, but then it leads to excesses.
What is fiat money? Sorry.
So you just print it. It's just you can print the money, and it's not connected to any particular value.
It worries me. It worries me that everything's become about banking, everything's become about finance, and nothing's about real economics.
As Sarah said, it's got to be connected to the real world. Once the end game becomes to accumulate this means of exchange, we need the means. I think none of us are saying we're living in a world where we don't need. Of course, we need money, but money is there to ensure that things are exchanged, that people get what they need. Not that it should be accumulated as an end So the people that we respect are the people who've got 100 billion, the pharaohs of this world, who have accumulated huge amounts of money, of animals, of property, and of slaves. Those are the ones that we revere at the moment.
But you can be thoroughly immoral,
yes,
and as long as it's not illegal, you'll get away with it. I mean, some of these obscene displays of wealth. I met a chap, and I won't say his name, who was constructing his 8th yacht, and his 8th yacht was going to cost $100 million, and the other 7 ranged in value from 20 million to 80 million. I mean, by the way, he still takes 4 weeks off work on holiday, so he can't even visit them. It's just insanity.
I think, as Philip's talked about, it's about that balance, going back to that environmental point, which is obviously the zeitgeist. Now we talk COP28, all of this type of thing. I think the book Silent Spring, which highlighted the environmental crisis, was written in 1962, so it's 60 odd years. And I think all the things that are happening now are laudable and we must support them. My own view is that until we understand that this created order is something that is held on trusteeship, as regency in Islam, we won't solve that.
But how did we end up in a situation? I'd love to ask both of you this, because I can't work this out. How did we end up in a situation where we worship money? Because, you've talked about fiat currency and all this. So literally, we're talking about quantitative easing, fiat currency. It's just money made up by the press of a button.
Yeah.
And yet we love it. It's numbers on a page. None of this stuff really exists. And yet it's become our new God.
It's what the Bible talks about as idol worship. It's a human inclination to want to consume. And the first sin is that there's one tree that they're not allowed to eat. All the other trees they're allowed to eat, but they want to consume the tree they're not allowed to eat because we want to consume more and more. We don't want limits. And therefore, as Pharaoh suffers to that inclination, he just wants more and more. And he's got everything he needs because he's got his palaces at the beginning. But this is the way it is. Money, there's no limit to it, especially as Suhail said, once the link to the gold standard went, there literally is no limit to how much money can be produced. And the last 60 odd years has seen a proliferation of money without any purpose. And therefore, what is it? And it's dangerous.
Philip, is the gold standard effectively biblical? Because you talk about the system of exchange, and I get this, the whole idea in the old days, what is it? I promised to pay £5 of sterling silver, right? So we can all swap that around. We all understand that. But now we're in a position where it's something different. But the Bible is still very clear that something backed to actual value as a system of exchange is okay and desirable.
No question. It's got to be real. In the second chapter of Genesis, it says gold is good. It talks about the Nile and the amount of the proliferation of water. It talks about 3 things. 1, which is gold. 2, there's a reference to the manna. And 3, there's a reference to the stones of Shoham, which I think is a ledger, because we do have to record money. I think the future money is not going to be us carrying around bags of gold, because that, I think, is beyond that. We need ledgers to write things down. But the gold is good right at the beginning. But that gold is something physical. Now,
is that so you can't dilute it? Because it is gold, it remains gold.
It's something
but it's a limit. Because the amount of gold and silver in the world is limited, which means you're naturally constraining across the world consumption. And the trouble is we don't constrain consumption and we overconsume. And what the Bible is saying is, no, there have to be real limits. Gold is good. And therefore, we have to start to constrain consumptions. And when you move off a gold standard, you have no constraint and it becomes limitless.
But I've said this before, Philip. The reason that I consume in the way that I consume is this. I have been told since I was a little kid that real happiness is being able to take out your phone or take out your mail order and be able to order any old junk you want. And I wake up in the morning with parcels here and packages there and all sorts arriving. Real happiness is not consumption, but that's what we're told, Philip.
You get confused. What really matters is looking after other people, looking after the planet, building relationships. And we think money builds relationships. In fact, money actually destroys relationships very often. That's not to say you give it away. I think neither of us are saying, and neither faith is saying, or Christianity, that you have to give away because that doesn't solve the problem, because giving away just means that the money's in someone else's hands. What you have to be is a trustee. You have to take responsibility to use it for the right end and to impose constraints. So again, the Manna story is crystal clear. Each day you consume the amount of food that you need. You have clothes, and that's the way we live. The fact that you've got more resources doesn't mean you consume more, because that makes you fat and that makes you obese and that makes you...
All right, son.
I'm sorry. Hello.
Well, I think your point around happiness, I think there's an important point that comes out of that. Is it about our physical consumption? Is it about... And that goes back to the nature of what humans are, and that's what the Abrahamic faith asks us to. You should enjoy this world, but there is another world to come. And also, we've now had some movement over the last few decades. GDP, this measurement, is it enough? Robert Kennedy did a famous speech at the University of Kansas in 1968, saying GDP, or GNP as he called it, measures everything other than what's important in our nation. And I think that has a certain resonance today.
How do you... So it ties into what I've been saying is, it's too complicated. Nobody understands what GDP. No one understands what profit. Even profit. I'm an accountant. There is no such thing as profit. It's a judgment. There's no such GDP. These are things that no one understands, and that is the reason why people have started to lose trust in everybody. They don't trust the state. They don't trust business. They don't trust each other, because we're using measures which are meaningless. And that's what Suhail is saying. We've got to have things that people understand. And it's got to be at a low level, right at the low level. How much food do you have? Have you got a home that you're secure in? Have you got a job that's secure? Have you got a community, a family that you can support? These are the things that people understand, and that's not what we're measuring.
But you keep talking about the same words keep coming up: security and love. The idea that you can get a job, but you don't own your own home. You're frightened of losing the house as a result of the mortgage. And what do? You buy yourself a car to make yourself feel better. Now, if you want a car because you need to drive, that's fair enough. But if what you're doing is replacing true happiness with the car, then that becomes a problem.
I think it goes back to balance. So you need to be able to consume and enjoy this life, but it isn't alone. And again, a good example of that, we've seen prosperity or through globalization, hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty.
Yes.
I think we should applaud that. That's wonderful. However, we are seeing globally, the US statistics, 1 in 4 people will have a mental health challenge in their lifetime. 17 to 19-year-olds in the UK have gone from 10% to 26% incidence of mental health disorder. So there is a challenge. Money is not providing that happiness. And I think when there's a vacuum, we erect false gods.
I agree with it. And the work that we're doing, we talked about enslaving the people, and the way he does it actually is it's sharecropping. So they don't own the land. They end up producing grain, but they've got to give 20% to Pharaoh for doing nothing. Now, what's crazy is it was theirs in the first place, because what Pharaoh does is he takes the excess, collects it in, and then sells it back to the people he's taking it away, and then charges them 20%. So effectively, that's the model we live in.